The massive Vorton warship floated silently in the darkness of space, surrounded by chunks of broken asteroids. Inside the ship's command center, Ambassador Veltar held a small metal object in his clawed hands. It was Earth's first interstellar probe, barely the size of a refrigerator, covered in scratched metal panels and primitive antennas. Veltar turned the probe over, studying its crude construction. His people had been traveling between stars for thousands of years using technology that could fold space itself. This human creation looked like something a child might build from scrap metal. The nuclear battery powering it was so basic that Vorthon students learned to build better ones in their first year of school. "Look at this pathetic thing," Veltar said to his aide, a younger Vorthon named Keksul. "These humans actually think. This garbage can carry their message across the galaxy. My personal transport ship has more advanced technology in its bathroom." Keksul examined the probe's simple radio transmitter. "Sir, according to our analysis, it took them decades just to launch this into space. Their entire species still lives on one small planet. They haven't even colonized their own star system properly." Veltar laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "And yet they dare to send us a message requesting membership in the Galactic Council. Can you imagine? These primitive creatures want to sit alongside civilizations that have ruled star systems since before their species even discovered fire." The probe carried a golden disc with pictures and sounds from Earth. Veltar had watched some of the recordings earlier. Humans looked fragile and weak, with their soft skin and tiny bodies. They lived for barely 100 years, which was nothing, compared to the 1,000-year lifespans of most council species. Their technology was laughably behind, their weapons were crude, and they had never even met another intelligent species before. "What should we do with their request, sir?" Keksul asked. Veltar's eyes gleamed with cruel amusement. "Oh, we'll grant them their audience. This will be entertaining." 3 weeks later, the Grand Council chamber buzzed with excitement. Representatives from 15 different star systems had gathered to witness something that had never happened before, a species so primitive requesting council membership. The chamber itself was a marvel of engineering, a transparent sphere floating in space with artificial gravity and atmosphere controls that could accommodate dozens of different alien physiologies. The Krolix ambassador squirmed in his tank of liquid methane, his tentacles dancing with barely contained laughter. "I haven't been this entertained in centuries," he gurgled through his translator. "What's next? Are we going to get membership requests from bacteria?" The crystalline Nexari delegate chimed in with sounds like breaking glass, which their translator rendered as mocking laughter. "My grandchildren could build better technology than these humans. They're not even Type 1 on the civilization scale." Ambassador Veltar stood at the center of the chamber, enjoying the attention. He had called this special session specifically to humiliate the humans publicly. It would serve as a warning to any other upstart species that might get ideas above their station. "Fellow council members," Veltar announced, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics, "we have received an amusing request. The species calling themselves humans from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star wish to join our ranks." The chamber erupted in laughter, clicking, chittering, and various other sounds of alien amusement. The Borthak representative, a creature that looked like a walking pile of rocks, rumbled with deep chuckles that shook the floor. Even the usually serious quantum minds, beings of pure energy who rarely showed emotion, flickered with what could only be described as amusement. "They claim to be intelligent," Veltar continued, "despite having never left their home planet except for brief visits to their tiny moon. They wage wars over patches of dirt. They poison their own atmosphere. They've had access to atomic energy for less than a century, and have already nearly destroyed themselves with it twice." More laughter filled the chamber. The ethereal collective's representative, a floating cloud of luminous gas, pulsed with colors that indicated extreme amusement in their species. "But here's the truly hilarious part," Veltar said, raising his voice over the noise. "They actually believe they deserve a place among us. They think their determination and spirit make up for their obvious technological and biological inferiority. The Void Stalkers, shadowy beings that existed partially outside normal space, made a sound like wind through a graveyard, their version of laughter. Veltar raised one clawed hand for silence. I propose we give them exactly what they want. Let's offer them the trials of ascension. The chamber fell quiet. Every representative knew about the trials. 7 challenges designed to test a species' worthiness for council membership. They were so difficult that no species in galactic history had ever completed more than 3 of them. Most gave up after the first trial. The trials? Asked the Krolix ambassador, his tentacles writhing with excitement. But sir, those are meant to be impossible. We designed them that way specifically to discourage unworthy species. Exactly, Veltar replied with a cruel smile. These humans want to prove themselves so badly. Let them try. When they fail miserably, as they inevitably will, it will serve as a perfect example to any other primitive species that might get similar ideas. The council voted immediately. All 15 species agreed unanimously. The humans would be offered the trials of ascension, and the galaxy would have a good laugh watching them fail. What none of them realized was that they had just made the biggest mistake in galactic history. They had challenged humanity to prove itself, and humans never ever quit. Captain Lee pressed her palm against the cool metal of the observation window, staring out at what could only be described as space gone completely insane. The maze of echoing stars stretched before them, like a cosmic horror story come to life. Swirling clouds of purple and gold gas twisted in patterns that hurt to look at directly, while streaks of lightning that wasn't quite lightning danced between. Dimensions that shouldn't exist. This is our first trial, Lee said quietly to herself, then turned to address her crew. All right, everyone, gather around. Let me explain what we're dealing with here. The bridge of the Persistence wasn't much to look at, compared to the sleek alien vessels watching from a safe distance. Earth's engineers had built it using the best technology humanity could manage, but next to the Vorthan ships, with their impossible curves and glowing hulls, it looked like a metal box held together with determination and duct tape. Navigator Park looked up from her instruments, worry creasing her young face. Captain, I've been studying the sensor readings for the past hour. This nebula doesn't follow any natural laws, I understand. The passages shift every few minutes, sometimes every few seconds. What looks like a clear path suddenly becomes a dead end or leads somewhere completely different. Engineer Kim wiped grease from his hands with an old rag. The quantum storms are the real problem, sir. They're not just disrupting our navigation. They're actually changing the structure of space itself inside that thing. Our hull is rated for normal space travel, not for having reality twist around us like a pretzel. Communications Officer Han adjusted her headset and frowned at her readings. Captain, I'm picking up transmissions from the alien observer fleet. They're taking bets on us. Bets? Lee raised an eyebrow. Yes, sir. Most of them are betting we'll turn around and head home within 3 days. A few are giving us a week. The Vorthan ambassador Veltar, he's so confident we'll quit that he's bet his personal yacht on it. The crew exchanged glances. They all knew what this meant. In the aliens' minds, humans were already defeated before they'd even started. The observer ships were here for entertainment, not because they expected to witness anything impressive. Lee walked over to the main display screen, where a 3-dimensional map showed what little they knew about the maze. Previous attempts by other species had mapped small sections before giving up, but the information was fragmentary and probably outdated since the passages kept changing. How long do the alien records say the longest attempt lasted? Lee asked. Park checked her computer. 18 days, sir. A species called the Zenthari made it about 15% of the way through before retreating. Most others lasted less than a week. And how many species have actually made it through this maze? In galactic history? None, sir, 0. That's why it's the first trial. It's designed to make species give up and go home. Lee nodded slowly, then smiled in a way that made her crew straighten up with renewed confidence. They'd seen that smile before, usually right before their captain did something that defied common sense and somehow worked anyway. Well then, Lee said, settling into her command chair. I guess we're about to rewrite some history. All stations, prepare for entry into the maze of echoing stars. And Han? Yes, sir. Send a message to those alien observers. Tell them they might want to settle in for a long show, because we're not coming back out until we've found the other side. The first week nearly broke them. The Persistence twisted and turned through passages that changed while they were still inside them. Twice they found themselves somehow traveling backwards without having turned around. Once they emerged from what looked like a tunnel, only to discover they were somehow upside down relative to where they'd started, with the nebula's floor now above their heads. Engineer Kim barely slept, constantly adjusting their engines to compensate for space that kept deciding to follow different rules. "Captain, our hull is holding together, but I'm having to recalibrate everything every few hours. The quantum storms keep changing how our systems interact with local space." Navigator Park had given up trying to make traditional maps. Instead, she'd started creating what she called probability charts, best guesses about where passages might lead, based on patterns that weren't quite patterns. "It's like trying to navigate through a dream that keeps changing its mind about what it wants to be," she explained to anyone who asked. Communications Officer Han had the hardest job of all. The quantum storms didn't just shift space, they interfered with all forms of communication. Every few hours their link to Earth would cut out completely, and Han would have to rebuild their transmitter array from scratch, sometimes using parts from other systems just to get a signal through. "How are we even still getting messages through to Earth?" Kim asked during one of their brief rest periods. Han looked exhausted but determined. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. I think the quantum storms are actually helping sometimes, bouncing our signals through dimensions that don't normally exist. It's like the universe is playing telephone with itself." By the end of the first month, the alien observers had stopped taking bets and started taking notes. Their entertainment had turned into something unprecedented. No species had ever lasted this long inside the maze, let alone continued making forward progress. By the third month, even the Vorthon fleet had moved closer, their scientific instruments trained on the tiny human ship that kept somehow finding ways through impossible passages. Ambassador Veltar stood in his flagship's observation deck, watching the Persistence navigate another section that had stumped his own people's best pilots. "This makes no sense," he muttered to his aide. "They should have given up months ago. Their technology is inferior. Their ship is falling apart. What are they running on?" The answer came during the 6th month, when the Persistence finally emerged. From the far side of the maze of echoing stars, the ship looked like it had been through a war. Sections of hull plating were missing. One engine was held together with improvised welds, and their communications array had been rebuilt so many times it barely resembled its original design. But they had made it through. The first species in galactic history to successfully navigate the maze of echoing stars. The alien observer fleet sat in stunned silence as the battered human ship transmitted a simple message. "Trial 1 complete. Ready for Trial 2. Veltar stared at the transmission for a long moment, then whispered the word that would haunt him for the rest of his very long life. Impossible. The heat was unbearable. Captain Lee stood on the bridge of the Persistence, watching the twin suns of the Helios system grow larger on their main screen. These weren't ordinary stars. They were locked in a deadly dance, spinning around each other so fast that they threw off massive streams of plasma and radiation that could melt most. Known materials in seconds. Somewhere deep in that hellish inferno, a ship was dying. "Captain," Communications Officer Han called out, her voice tight with concern. "I'm picking up the distress signal again. It's definitely coming from inside the corona of the larger star." The corona, the superheated atmosphere surrounding a star where temperatures reached millions of degrees. Nothing was supposed to survive in there, yet somehow an alien vessel had ended up trapped in that cosmic furnace with its crew still alive. Engineer So looked up from his diagnostic panel, sweat already beading on his forehead, despite the ship's cooling systems running at maximum. "Sir, I need to be honest with you. Our heat shields weren't designed for this. We might be able to survive a quick pass through the outer corona, but a rescue mission, that means staying in there long enough to locate survivors, match their trajectory and extract them. I'm not sure our ship can handle that kind of punishment." Medical Officer Cho had been studying the alien distress signal's technical specifications. According to their transmission, there are 47 crew members still alive on that ship. They're from a species called the Valorians. They have a higher heat tolerance than humans, but even they're dying from the radiation exposure. Lee studied the tactical display showing the binary star system. The trapped ship was deep inside the corona of the larger star, caught in the gravitational pull between both suns. The only way to reach them would be to dive directly into what was essentially a sea of nuclear fire. "What's our maximum safe exposure time?" Lee asked, so ran some quick calculations. "In the outer corona, maybe 20 minutes before our hull starts to fail. But where that ship is located? Captain, we'd be lucky to last 5 minutes before our systems start shutting down from the heat. And how long would the rescue operation take?" "At least 30 minutes, sir. We'd need to match their position, dock with their ship, transfer the survivors, and then fight our way back out against the gravitational pull of both stars." The bridge fell quiet except for the hum of the cooling systems and the occasional beep from their instruments. Everyone understood what this meant. The math didn't work. A rescue was theoretically impossible. Pilot Arn broke the silence. "Captain, there's something else. The alien observer fleet is offering us an alternative." "What kind of alternative?" "They're saying we can complete this trial by simply attempting the rescue. They consider flying into a star's corona to be proof enough of courage. We don't actually have to save anyone." Lee turned to look at her crew. They'd already completed 3 of the 7 trials, something no species in galactic history had managed. They were exhausted. Their ship was held together with improvised repairs, and they'd already lost 6 crew members in the previous challenges. "They're giving us an out," Lee said quietly. "We could make a token attempt, turn back when it gets too dangerous, and still pass this trial." Engineer So nodded. "It would be the smart play, sir. We've already proven more than anyone expected." "The observers would understand," added Han. "Even they don't expect us to actually succeed at a rescue in those conditions." Lee walked over to the communication station and replayed the alien distress call. The voices were desperate, speaking in a language the ship's computer had to translate, but the fear and hope in their words needed no translation. "Negative," Lee said finally, her voice carrying the tone that her crew knew meant the decision was final. "We don't leave people behind. It's not who we are." The descent into hell began immediately. As the Persistence dove toward the binary stars, the temperature readings on every panel started climbing at an alarming rate. The ship's hull, already scarred from previous trials, began to glow a dull red as they entered the outer layers of the star's atmosphere. "Hull temperature rising rapidly," So called out, his instruments already showing readings in the danger zone. "We're at 60% of safe limits and climbing." The bridge itself was becoming an oven. Despite the life support systems working overtime, the crew could feel the heat seeping through the walls. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat, and touching any metal surface was becoming painful. "There!" Navigator Park shouted, pointing at the main screen. "I've got them on sensors. The Valorian ship is 3 kilometers dead ahead, caught in a plasma stream between the 2 stars." Lee could see it now. A sleek alien vessel that looked nothing like their own boxy human design, tumbling slowly as it was pulled deeper into the star's gravity well. Parts of its hull were already glowing white-hot, and she could see atmosphere venting from several hull breaches. "So give me everything we've got," Lee ordered. "I want maximum power to the heat shields." "Captain, I'm already pushing our systems beyond safe limits. If I give you more power, we risk a complete shutdown." "Do it anyway." The ship shuddered as So diverted power from non-essential systems. The lights dimmed, the artificial gravity fluctuated, and several secondary systems went offline. But their heat shields strengthened just enough to buy them precious extra minutes. Pilot Arn's hands were already showing burns from touching the controls, but he maintained their course with steady precision, matching their trajectory now. "This is going to be close." Medical Officer Cho had prepared the ship's cargo bay as an emergency treatment center, but as they got closer to the dying alien ship, she suddenly collapsed at her station. The radiation was so intense that even their shielding couldn't block it completely. "Cho's down," Han called out, moving to help the medical officer. "I'm fine," Cho insisted, pulling herself back to her feet even as blood trickled from her nose, a clear sign of radiation poisoning. "Just get me to those survivors." The docking process took place in conditions that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Both ships were tumbling through a sea of plasma that could vaporize them instantly if their shields failed. Arn had to calculate trajectories while the gravitational pull of two massive stars tried to tear them apart. "Docking clamps engaged," he announced, his voice strained from the effort of maintaining control, while his hands blistered from the superheated controls. What followed was 30 minutes of pure chaos. The human crew, already pushed beyond their physical limits, worked frantically to transfer 47 alien survivors from one dying ship to another. Some of the Valorians were unconscious from radiation exposure. Others were injured from their ship's structural failures. Medical Officer Cho, now so sick from radiation that she could barely stand, directed the rescue effort from the cargo bay floor, treating patients while lying on her back because she was too weak to sit up. Engineer. So kept their failing systems running through sheer force of will, manually overriding safety protocols and rebuilding circuits with his bare hands as they burned out from the intense heat. The alien observer fleet watched in stunned silence as the human ship, now glowing like a coal from the stellar radiation, fought its way back out of the corona with its precious cargo of survivors. Half the human crew died in the process, but not one of them asked to be evacuated when the alien rescue ships offered. When the Persistence finally emerged from the star's corona, battered and barely functional, Captain Lee transmitted a simple message to the observer fleet. 47 survivors recovered. Trial complete. Ambassador Veltar stared at his instruments, unable to process what he'd just witnessed. No species in galactic history had ever attempted such a rescue, let alone succeeded. These humans had literally flown into a star to save people they'd never met, from a species they'd never encountered before. For the first time since the trials began, Veltar felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries: fear. What kind of creatures were these humans, and what had the Council unleashed by challenging them? The void between had a name that didn't really capture how terrifying it actually was. It wasn't just empty space. It was a region where the normal rules of existence simply didn't apply. Looking out the viewport of the Persistence was like staring into a kaleidoscope designed by something that had never seen reality and didn't care to learn. Captain Lee stood on what remained of her bridge, gripping the back of her command chair to steady herself. The chair itself flickered between existing and not existing, sometimes appearing as a normal piece of furniture, other times looking like it was made of crystallized screams or folded starlight. She'd learned not to trust her eyes anymore. Day 43 in the void, she announced to her remaining crew. Though she wasn't entirely sure time worked the same way here, her chronometer showed different readings every time she looked at it, sometimes running backwards, occasionally displaying symbols that hurt to look at directly. Only 12 humans remained alive on the ship. They'd started the trials with a crew of 85. The maze of echoing stars had claimed 6. The test of living fire had taken 39 more. The 4th and 5th trials, the labyrinth of mirrors and the sea of whispers, had cost them another 28 crew members. Now they were attempting what no species in galactic history had ever managed, surviving the 6th trial, passage, through the void between. Communications Officer Yu looked up from her station, or at least Lee thought it was Yu. Sometimes the crew members' faces shifted and changed, showing different people entirely. Yu's hands were raw and bleeding from constantly rebuilding their communication equipment with whatever materials she could scavenge. "Captain," Yu said, her voice sounding sometimes like herself, sometimes like people she'd never met. "I managed to get a signal through to Earth for about 30 seconds yesterday, I think. Time gets weird when I'm working on the transmitter. The communication equipment itself was a nightmare to look at. What had started as standard human technology had been rebuilt so many times with salvaged alien parts and materials that didn't exist in normal space that it resembled something between a radio and an abstract art installation. Wires connected to components that flickered in and out of reality, and some parts seemed to be held together by Yu's pure determination to maintain contact with home. "Any response from Earth?" Lee asked. They're proud of us, sir. Mission Control says the whole planet is watching. People are holding vigils, praying for us, sending messages of support. I recorded some of them before the signal cut out. Yu's voice broke slightly. "There are children drawing pictures of our ship. They're calling us heroes." Engineer Bay laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Heroes," he muttered, welding another hull breach that had appeared overnight. The breach itself was wrong. It was shaped like a perfect spiral, and looking at it too long made your brain hurt. Heroes don't usually go insane while trying to keep their ship from falling apart in dimensions that shouldn't exist. Bay had been having the worst time with the Void's effects. The region seemed to specialize in showing people things that would break their minds, and for Bay, that meant constant visions of his family back on Earth. His wife and 2 young children appeared to him regularly, begging him to come home, telling him he'd done enough, that he could stop trying and rest. "They're not real," he would mutter to himself while working. "They're not real, they're not real." But Lee could see the pain in his eyes every time his dead daughter asked him why he'd left her. The thing was, Bay's family wasn't actually dead. They were safe on Earth, probably watching news reports about the trials and hoping their husband and father would come home. But the void between specialized in lies that felt more real than reality. Navigator O had perhaps the most important and most impossible job of all. She had to plot courses through space that followed rules that changed constantly. Her navigation charts looked like the scribblings of someone having a breakdown, covered in equations that used mathematics that didn't exist and measurements for dimensions that weren't supposed to be there. "Captain," O called out, her voice strained from the constant mental effort of trying to make sense of the impossible. "I think I've found a route through the next section. The space there seems to be mostly normal, except for the gravity that flows upward and the light that casts shadows backwards. That's the most normal thing we've encountered in weeks," Lee replied, and she wasn't joking. The worst part wasn't the physical challenges or even the hallucinations. It was the way the void between attacked their sense of purpose. Every day, every hour it whispered to them that they should give up. Not through voices or visions, but through a constant pressure on their minds that made quitting seem like the most logical thing in the universe. Why were they doing this? Why were they suffering through hell itself just to prove something to aliens who had already made up their minds about humanity? Wouldn't it be easier to just stop, to turn around, to accept that some challenges were impossible? The alien observer fleets had long since stopped following them into the void between. Even their most advanced ships with crews trained for thousands of years couldn't handle the psychological pressure. They waited at the edges of the region, monitoring from a safe distance, expecting at any moment to detect the humans finally turning back. Ambassador Veltar stood in his flagship's command center, staring at the sensor readings that tracked the tiny human ship. It had been moving forward for over 6 weeks now, deeper into the void between than any vessel had ever traveled. "Sir," his aide Kexel said quietly, "perhaps we should call off the trials. This has gone far beyond what we intended." "Call them off?" Veltar's voice was barely a whisper. "Look at those readings, Kexel. They're 3/4 of the way through the void between. Do you understand what that means?" Kexel checked his instruments again, hoping he'd made an error. "It means they might actually make it to the 7th trial. It means we may have made a terrible mistake. No species has ever reached the 7th trial, because no species was supposed to reach the 7th trial. We designed these challenges to be impossible." Back on the Persistence, Captain Lee made her daily rounds of the ship, checking on her crew and the systems that kept them alive. The ship itself had become something between a vessel and a living creature. Parts of it had been rebuilt so many times with materials from the void that sections of the hull seemed to breathe, and some corridors led to rooms that weren't there yesterday. "Status report," she called out, her voice steady despite the constant whispers in her mind telling her she was a fool for continuing. Engineer Bay looked up from his work, his eyes red from exhaustion and tears he wouldn't admit to shedding. "Ship's falling apart, sir. Engines are held together with prayer and spite. The hull has 17 new breaches that opened up overnight, and our life support is running on systems I built from spare parts and wishful thinking. Crew status, same as the ship, sir. We're all going a little crazy. We're seeing things that aren't there, and we're pretty sure we're never going home." He paused, then added with a grim smile, "But we're still moving forward. Navigation officer." O plotted another course through impossible space, trusting mathematics when her eyes showed her colors, that didn't have names and directions that led everywhere and nowhere at once. Communications Officer U rebuilt their transmitter array for the 44th time, her bleeding hands working automatically, while her mind focused on the voices of children from Earth who believed in them, and Captain Lee stood at the center of it all, holding her crew together through force of will and the simple human refusal to quit when the universe itself was telling them to give up. Somewhere in the distance, growing slowly larger on their sensors, was the exit from the void between. And beyond that, the seventh and final trial that no species in galactic history had ever faced. They were almost there, almost at the end of the impossible. The arena of final judgment was older than most civilizations, built from materials that existed before the first stars formed. It floated in the void between galaxies, a perfect sphere of crystallized space-time that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Inside its transparent walls, champions from across the galaxy had fought for honor, for glory, and for the right to call themselves worthy. Captain Lee stood in the center of the arena, and she looked like hell. 6 trials had broken her body in ways that should have killed any living creature. Her left arm hung useless at her side, shattered during their escape from the void between, when a section of the ship's hull had collapsed on her. 3 ribs were cracked from the test of living fire, and she could taste blood every time she breathed. Her right leg barely supported her weight, damaged in the 4th trial when she'd personally carried 12 injured crew members to safety through a collapsing dimensional maze. She was alone now. The 12 crew members who had survived the 6th trial hadn't made it to the 7th. Navigator O had died when their ship finally gave out just outside the arena, her last act being to plot a course that got the escape pods to safety. Communications. Officer U had succumbed to radiation poisoning 3 days earlier, still trying to send a final message to Earth with equipment that no longer existed. Engineer Bay had simply stopped. The constant visions of his family calling him home had finally won, and he'd walked into an airlock with a smile on his face, saying he was going to see his children again. The Persistence itself was nothing but debris now, scattered across 3 star systems. What had once been humanity's finest spacecraft was gone, destroyed piece by piece, in humanity's impossible journey through challenges that were never meant to be survived. Across from Lee stood War Master Thekran, the Vorthan Empire's greatest champion. He was 3 meters tall, covered in natural armor plating that had turned aside weapons capable of cracking planets. His 4 arms each carried a different weapon, and his combat record stretched back over 6 centuries. He had never lost a single battle. The arena's viewing galleries were packed with representatives from every major civilization in the galaxy. They'd come to witness something that had never happened before, the 7th trial. Most were there, out of scientific curiosity, wanting to document how this strange human species would finally meet its end. Ambassador Veltar sat in the place of honor, but he no longer looked confident. The arrogant alien who had dismissed humanity months ago now watched with something approaching fear. These humans had done the impossible 6 times in a row. What if they somehow managed to do it again? Combat begins when the arena chimes, announced the ancient AI that governed the trials. Victory is achieved through surrender, incapacitation, or death of the opponent. Are both fighters ready? War Master Thekran raised his weapons in the traditional salute. His movements were fluid, perfect, the result of centuries of training and natural advantages that made him nearly invincible. Captain Lee picked up the simple metal sword the arena had provided her, the same basic weapon offered to all challengers. In her damaged state, she could barely lift it properly. The chime rang out across the arena, a sound like crystallized eternity. What followed was not really a fight. It was a demonstration of the difference between an apex predator and a broken prey animal. Thekran moved with impossible speed and precision, his 4 weapons creating a whirlwind of destruction that Lee could barely perceive, let alone counter. She tried to block his first strike and failed. The impact sent her flying across the arena floor, her sword spinning away into the distance. Before she could even attempt to get up, Thekran was on her again, his blade stopping just short of her throat. "Yield," he said in the common galactic tongue. You have fought with honor, but this contest is over. Lee spat blood and rolled away, scrambling for her weapon. Thekaran let her get it, curious to see what this strange creature would do. She attacked again, putting everything she had left into a desperate charge. Thekaran deflected her strike casually and responded with a counterattack that sent her crashing into the arena wall hard enough to crack the ancient material. "Yield," he repeated, genuine respect in his voice. "You have proven your courage. There is no shame in surrender." Lee pulled herself to her feet, swaying dangerously. Her vision was blurring, and she was pretty sure her left lung had collapsed. But she raised her sword again. This time Thekaran's response was swift and brutal. He disarmed her in seconds, then delivered a series of precise strikes that shattered her remaining ribs and left her lying broken on the arena floor. The fight had lasted exactly 17 minutes. Lee lay there, barely conscious, blood pooling beneath her. Every breath was agony. Her body had reached the absolute limit of what human physiology could endure. By any reasonable measure, she was defeated. The honorable thing was surrender. The logical thing was surrender. Every species in galactic history would have surrendered. Instead, Captain Lee began to crawl toward her weapon. The arena fell completely. Silent, tens of thousands of alien spectators watched in stunned disbelief as this broken human, who should have been unconscious or dead, dragged herself across the floor with her one functioning arm. War Master Thekaran stepped back, confusion replacing the confidence on his face. "What are you doing?" he asked. "The fight is over. You cannot possibly continue." Lee's hand closed around the handle of her sword. With tremendous effort, she began to pull herself upright, using the blade as a crutch. Blood ran freely from her mouth as she spoke. "Fight's not over," she gasped, "until one of us can't fight anymore." "But you cannot fight anymore," Thekaran protested. "Your body is broken. Your weapons cannot penetrate my armor. You have no chance of victory." Lee finally managed to get to her feet, though she swayed like a tree in a hurricane. She raised her sword with shaking hands, the blade wavering in the air. "Doesn't matter," she said, her voice stronger now despite the blood. "We don't quit. That's not who we are." For the first time in 6 centuries of combat, War Master Thekaran felt something he'd never experienced before. Fear. Not fear of losing. He knew he could defeat this human with his next attack. It was a deeper, more primal fear of something he didn't understand. "Why?" he whispered, backing away from the bleeding human. "Why won't you stop? You've already proven your courage. You've done more than any species in galactic history. Why continue when you know you cannot win?" Lee grinned through split lips, and somehow that smile was more terrifying than any weapon. "Because giving up isn't in our programming. We'd rather die trying than live knowing we quit." The silence in the arena stretched for an eternity. War Master Thekaran, the greatest warrior in Vorthan history, slowly lowered his weapons. "I cannot fight you," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's perfect acoustics. "I cannot fight an opponent who will not yield. Victory has no meaning against such determination." He turned to face the viewing galleries, addressing the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. "This human has won," he announced. "Not through superior skill or strength, but through something I have never encountered before. She has won through the simple refusal to accept defeat." The arena erupted in chaos. Representatives from dozens of species shouted arguments, demanded explanations, called for reviews of the rules. But Ambassador Veltar sat in stunned silence, finally understanding what humanity truly was. The Galactic Council's emergency session lasted for 3 days. They debated, argued, and analyzed every aspect of what they'd witnessed. In the end, they voted unanimously on 2 decisions. First, humanity was granted immediate membership in the Galactic Council, with all the rights and privileges that entailed. Second, and far more importantly, they established what would become known throughout the galaxy as the first universal law. It was carved into quantum steel tablets and broadcast to every inhabited world in known space. Never challenge humans to prove themselves. They will die before they quit, and somehow find victory in their dying. Ambassador Veltar personally delivered humanity's council membership to Earth, his hands shaking as he presented the quantum seal to the species that had just changed the fundamental understanding of what was possible in the universe. As his ship entered Earth's solar system, Veltar looked out at the small blue world that had produced such terrifying determination. For the first time in his long life, he wondered if perhaps the galaxy needed humanity more than humanity needed the galaxy. After all, they'd just proven that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from being the strongest or the smartest, but from simply refusing to give up when everyone else would. And that, Veltar realized with a shiver, was perhaps the most dangerous power in the universe.